coming to the Norwich Bookstore. I'm Andy, one of the booksellers here. Thanks for coming out on a March evening. This is like such a weird time of year, I feel like. Like it's cold at night and it's warmer during the day, but the wind is going, which is unsettling. But it's kind of a really good atmosphere for reading one of Margot Livesey's books, I would say. So it's kind of perfect. If you have phones on, please silence them. Most of us live with them on silence all the time, but just in case, that'd be great. Also, we have plenty of Margot's books up at the counter, plenty of Peter's books up at the counter. Browse all their other books. We're happy to help you. Okay, tonight we have Peter Orner in one corner. I don't really feel like I have to introduce him because everyone knows him, but just in case there's someone here who doesn't, a 3-time recipient of the Pushcart Prize, author of 6 books, a finalist for the Penn Hemingway Award, the recipient of the Rome Prize, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and a Fulbright to Namibia. Orner also directs the creative writing program down the road at Dartmouth College, and he's a frequent customer, so we like that. And Margot Livesey, I'm really excited that Margot Livesey's here. Let me just say, I've been reading her for decades, and it's very cool to meet your literary heroes. So, excuse me while I fangirl just a little bit. She was born and grew up on the edge of the Scottish Highlands. She's the author of a collection of stories and 9 other novels, including The Boy in the Field from 2020, and her newest one, The Road from Belhaven, which I have not read yet. It's at the top of the stack, but I just tried to get to it before tonight, but didn't quite make it. I have children, that's why. Anyway, she has received awards from the NEA, the Guggenheim Foundation, and the Radcliffe Institute. She lives in Cambridge, Mass., is on the faculty of the Iowa Writers Workshop. Her books are beautiful, compelling, and effective, and her characters stick around you like ghosts. I'm thrilled to invite you to join me in welcoming her to the Norwich Bookstore. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to be back here, and I'm thrilled to be here with the amazing Peter Orner, whose work I've been reading, we discovered, for over 20 years. I think 22 years, 24 years. And I'm honoured to have one of my oldest friends in the audience, Susan Bryson. It's always a thrill for me to be in her presence. And she's largely responsible for me being here tonight, or being on the planet, I would say. I'm just going to read a few pages from the opening of The Road from Belhaven to introduce the voice and the territory of the novel. The Road from Belhaven. The summer she was 10, she learned not to speak of it. She told the hens, she told the cows, she told the pond at the bottom of the field and the ducks who swam there, and her pet jackdaw, Alice. But she did not tell her grandparents, Rab and Flora, or Hugh, the farm boy, or Nellie, who had helped in the house when she, Lizzie, was learning to walk, and whom they still saw every day, every week at the kirk. The first picture came on a dreich November day. Her grandmother was in the dairy skimming milk, her grandfather in the fields digging potatoes. Lizzie was beneath the kitchen table making scones for her doll. She must have been 3 or 4 years old when the flagstone floor and her bowl and spoon disappeared. Instead, she was watching her grandfather, his shirt sleeves rolled up, scything hay in the meadow by the river. He was working his way along the bank, cutting wide swathes. One moment the hay was upright, the next fallen. At the end of the row, he stopped to sharpen the scythe. Lizzie could see his shirt clinging to his back as he ran the whetstone back and forth. He was starting on the next row when the blade bit his leg. She was still exclaiming no, scrambling from beneath the table, when the kitchen door opened and her grandfather stepped into the room, carrying a basket of potatoes. As he washed them at the sink, Lizzie patted his legs, searching for the cut beneath the rough fabric of his trousers. "What is it, Lizzie?" he said. "Do I have mud on me?" She told him what she'd seen. "I'd have to be Guy Clumsy," he said, "to cut myself digging tatties." She was still wondering why she'd seen a scythe, not a fork, why the sun had been shining though the sky was grey, when her grandmother returned, and together they went to feed the hens. By the following July, when Neil, their neighbour, carried her grandfather home in a wheelbarrow, Lizzie had forgotten the scene beneath the table. Only as Dr. Murray made dark, untidy stitches in Rab's leg did she recall her glimpse of the meadow months before. She thought of them as pictures because she could see everything so clearly, as if she were standing nearby, although she never saw herself. Sometimes she saw ordinary things, her grandmother choosing which hen to kill, a cow stuck in the mud by the river. She saw a picture of Nellie in a white dress at the front of the church, and 3 months later Nellie announced she was marrying Angus. "You could have knocked me down with a feather," her grandmother said, reporting the news at supper. Lizzie started to say she had known for weeks, but her grandfather was already talking about the sheep shearing. All this happened at Belhaven Farm, which was in that part of Scotland called the Kingdom of Fife, surrounded on 3 sides by water. The Firth of Forth to the south, the North Sea to the east, the Tay estuary to the north. Fife was known for its collieries, its fishing and its university in St Andrews, but the farm was inland, far from the coal mines. The year of Lizzie's birth, the explorer David Livingstone died in Africa, the RMS Atlantic sank off Nova Scotia, and the Scottish Rugby Union was founded. On the farm, the most notable events besides her arrival were the mild weather and the early harvest. Where were her parents? On the wall of her bedroom. Her mother had made the drawing the day they got married. Helen, wearing a dress, the folds nicely shaded, was sitting in a chair. Teddy, in his Sunday suit, stood behind her, his left hand resting on her shoulder. Lizzie seldom glanced at them, but every morning she looked at the little white house with 2 red doors which had belonged to Helen and which stood on her chest of drawers. In fine weather, the woman came out of her door. In bad weather, the man emerged. Sometimes each hovered on the threshold, but they could never come out at the same time. Besides the weather house and the drawing, Lizzie had inherited her mother's border terrier, William, whom they buried in the apple orchard soon after her grandfather cut himself, and a handful of stories. Helen could undo any knot. She could imitate a thrush so that birds sang back. She had rescued a calf from drowning in the river. She was partial to gooseberry jam. About her father, Lizzie knew even less. Teddy had been a fisherman. His boat was named St. Fillan after the saint who had lived in a cave on the Fife coast and wrote by the light of his glowing left arm. But neither God nor St. Fillan had saved Teddy's boat when the fog rolled in one October day. 7 months later, Lizzie was born. 12 months later, Helen died. Not because of you, her grandmother had said. Pneumonia. Your father drowned in one way, your mother in another. Thank you.
I'd like to hear more. Is this working? Is this on? Oh, I'm not recording for the room, am I? This is for the room. I see. Do I need this? Okay. But this is for you. Sorry, I didn't catch that part of
I
it.
think you're meant to do it on the neck.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Sorry, I was supposed to prepare earlier. I was too enraptured by the reading. Excuse me. Oh, it opens, yeah. Okay. I was making it much more complicated. Thank you, Margot. That's such a beautiful reading. And I mean, I have a lot to say, but I want to just, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about just what you just the part you just read, in particular the part about Lizzie's parents, and when you say that her mother was a handful of stories, Helen could undo any knot, she could imitate a thrush, etc. I was thinking about this idea of people being a handful of stories, right? I mean, this is what she's got, but these parents on the wall and in this picture recur throughout the book. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you could, I'm going off script.
Yeah. Oh. I was a child with a mother on the wall. I had a photograph of my mother that hung over my bed. I never used the word mother. I always called her by name, Eva, because that was what the people around me called her. So I gave my heroine, my protagonist, Lizzie Craig, that same relationship, if you will, to her parents. And I think there's something about orphans that I find very, very persuasive, very attractive, like many readers. I mean, we have so many great orphan stories. David Copperfield, Harry Potter, Anne of Green Gables, the list goes on. And I think there's something about the orphan that it's all our stories writ large without a safety net. It's the great what if. So I wanted to make very clear, very early in the novel, that Lizzie is an orphan in a certain sense, although she does have her grandparents very present in her life.
Absolutely. I had such a wonderful 10 days or so reading this novel, and how some books just come at the right time, and I love Margot's books, and I've been reading them for years and years, and I always turn to them in moments of sort of like needing some humanity, and some humaneness. I mean, there's a lot of darkness in this book. Don't get the wrong idea, but there's something about my immersion in this world that was just so. It just was invigorating in the sense of just I had like more hope than I have had lately. So I want to thank you again and again, always. Can you talk about characters and talk about? I mean, what I love about this book and your work in general is that I get to know the people like backwards and forwards. And I'm just wondering if you could talk about your approach to Lizzie and how she came into being and the relationship between earlier books and your family history.
I'd be delighted. Eva, whom I just mentioned, died when I was 2.5, and my father died when I was 22, and they were both only children. So at that point, I believed myself to have no living relatives in any meaningful way. And that belief persisted for well over 40 years, until 2017, when a former student was doing research into her family on Ancestry.com. And for reasons that remain just a little unclear to me, she began to do research into my family. But if you know how Ancestry.com works, then people can see who's been working or consulting a family tree. And so Irene received a letter asking, did Eva McEwen have a living child? She forwarded this letter to me, and I wrote back to the writer saying she did have a living child, and I am she. The writer of the letter was a woman named Gail Phipps, who lives in Australia near Brisbane. And it turned out I had been quite wrong for the last 40 years. I had many relatives. They just all happened to live near Brisbane. So Gail was quite a persuasive and lovely person. And within a few months, I was on a plane to Brisbane to meet these people who claimed to be related to me. And I felt like a water diviner looking for water, holding the sticks, waiting to see if they twitched. I kept thinking, am I going to feel something special because you're my second cousin twice removed? Am I going to feel some kinship because you're my third cousin once? I never quite got the removed thing straight. So And I will confess that on most occasions they just seemed like large Australian people with whom I felt no connection whatsoever. But there were two older members of the family. I am answering Peter's question, I promise. It's just a kind of long way round. There were two older members of the family, Gwen and John, siblings, well into their 80s. And I did feel a kinship with them. Was it because we had slightly higher percentage of DNA together? I do not know. But they told me about my great-grandmother, Lizzie Craig. They gave me a handful of stories about Lizzie Craig. And the most potent of those stories were to do with her second sight, with how she could see the future. And of course, I was very fascinated by that, and perhaps particularly fascinated because many years before I went to Australia, I had written a novel about my mother, Eva, and her relationship with the supernatural. So suddenly it began to seem that what I had thought was my mother's unique gift was actually a hereditary gift. And I will say before you ask that so far I do not have a strong relationship with the supernatural, but I'm still hopeful.
I'm just wondering, how did they put it? Like, how did they say, when they told you that she had a second sight, how did they explain it?
Well, they didn't think it was something that needed explanation. It was just a fact about her. You know, she had brown hair, she had blue eyes, she had a Scottish accent, she had second sight. They also told me that she could read tea leaves and had healing hands. But I decided that my character was not going to have quite such a cluster of gifts, because it began to feel a little confusing to have someone dashing from thing to thing.
Right.
But I will tell you the most concrete example they gave me, which it's hard to make sound impressive, but in 1938 or early in 39, she predicted that the Japanese would enter the Second World War on the side of the Germans, which this was years before Pearl Harbor, and it was a very surprising thing to see. So it made a deep impression on them.
I would think. In the book, what is so wonderful and counterintuitive about this gift is that it isn't a gift that she can sort of deploy to help her. It's the way you describe her second sight in the novel is that she, as you read, she gets an image, she gets a picture of her grandfather cutting himself. She gets a picture of her grandmother picking hens, and throughout the book there's large, more important things having to do with children and other things that are less so, but it doesn't change anything, and it doesn't help her live her life. And that's what I adored about this. It was just a thing. It was just the list of characteristics, and yet it's fascinating. And she has this gift, but the gift is sort of nuanced, I would say.
Yeah. And because I lack Lizzie's gift, I did do research. And it turned out that I knew quite well two people who had second sight. I had known them for years without knowing this about them. It only came out when I started talking about my great-grandmother. And what they reported, I tried to capture the idea of this sort of italicized picture. So it really was about sight. It was different from, say, a premonition or telepathy or clairvoyance, or I suppose it is clairvoyance.
Or being, having the same. I mean, literally on the first page, she's in two places at once. I mean, she's under the table, and she's seeing her grandfather out in the field, and so it's something that comes and goes in the novel, and it's just something that she has, but she can't will it. She never knows when it's going to come, and it can't change anything. And I just thought it was such a wonderful way of dealing with that uncanny ability. you know, that it isn't, that it's a weight almost, but it's a beautiful one sometimes, and sometimes it's very much not.
Yeah. No, it is a complicated gift, and yeah, what does one do if one can see the future and one can't change it? And of course, there's always that sense: is seeing the future also creating the future?
Yes.
As in Macbeth meeting the three witches. I mean, I think most people feel he would not have killed Duncan if the three witches hadn't said, "You're going to kill Duncan."
Right.
So it's a very quixotic gift.
Well, for me, it was very much connected to Lizzie's imagination as a character in general, you know, and her. Lizzie's a big reader. Can you talk a little bit about her? There's one wonderful moment where she and her grandfather Rab, who's a complicated character, and you know, there's darkness in him that manifests in very concrete ways, let's say. But they're switching off reading Mansfield Park together. And I wonder if we could just talk about, and you talk about in the afterword your influence, and you're going back and rereading these books of your childhood, and one of them appears in the scene.
Yeah. In my writing workshops, I'd have to say my students, by and large, don't like characters who are writers. Maybe they feel they know too many writers already. But I thought it was all right to make Lizzie a reader. I mean, that seemed acceptable. And it also was a way for me of making kind of common ground with her, to share with her the books I had read at her age. And I loved going back to them. I was also, though I would say, writing in a way against the scrim of the Victorian novel. I mean, life in Victorian Britain was not exactly like it's presented in the Victorian novel. To wit, I think in the 1850s, something like 1 in every 10 houses in London was a brothel. So imagine that in Norwich. Well, or maybe not.
It's a little bit hard to imagine.
So I was trying to kind of get behind that scrim. At the same time, I decided very consciously that I wasn't going to let Lizzie read Thomas Hardy, because I worried if she read Hardy, she would understand or begin to understand the mysteries of sexual attraction which are coming.
And she doesn't, right?
And she doesn't.
She doesn't, and that is a major aspect of the book. You know, I don't think it ruins anything. Well, I'll get to that in a moment. But I want to say the book is set in the 1880s, and it never once has any feel of that kind of historical weight. It absolutely has a sense of immediacy that just I flowed right into it. I never thought once about where I was in time in any questioning way. And I wonder if you could talk about how you did that. And here's one example, and I don't even know if this is a period detail, but every page there's details such as this one, and I might be getting this wrong. I couldn't find it, actually. I just remembered it. And that is that there's a line that says that Irish immigrants in Britain, some Irish immigrants anyway, carry some soil from back home in their pockets. And I thought that was just such a beautiful detail, and that is indicative of just literally on every page there's one of these details that just makes everything so real that it didn't, you know, I didn't never pause to wonder, oh, is this really 1880 or what? So I'm wondering if you could talk about how you put us in a place without making a big deal about it.
I knew I wanted to write a novel set in the 1880s. I wanted to be faithful to my great-grandmother's dates. But I also knew I didn't want the baggage that we sometimes find in historical fiction. So I mean, partly I just tried to think about my own childhood, which was in many ways fairly Victorian. And for 4 years, I went almost every day to a farm on the outskirts of a village, which was owned by a brother and sister, Selby and Chrissy, who could have stepped out of a William Trevor novel. They had inherited the farm from their parents, and they had gone so far as to buy a Land Rover and a tractor, but that was about the limit. So I got to see the farm in very intimate detail, and that was tremendously helpful. But I also sometimes just had to stop myself and think again, like on the opening page, I originally had Lizzie having a dolls party, dolls plural. And then I thought, no, she would only have one doll. She wouldn't have dolls plural. And over I sort of had to go catch myself and think about the economics of that time. And it was also a very exciting time because it was the age of industrialization, and finally you could leave the countryside and you could move to the city and you could hope to make a little bit of money. So people had an autonomy that they had not previously had, and that made it a very exciting period to write about and think about. But I also sometimes resisted my research. So one of the things I discovered reading Glasgow newspapers of that period was that there was a Chinese man who was working as a juggler around the streets of Glasgow. And I thought that was incredibly interesting, but that it would somehow be the kind of thing, if I put it in the novel, it would just become sort of exoticized. And so I had to resist certain captivating things that I would have loved to include.
That's fascinating, and that it's a great story. But I know what you mean, where you can't follow every trail, right? Otherwise, you'll lose where you were heading.
Yeah, maybe a haiku for him.
Exactly. You talk about economics, which plays a big role in the book, and farm being rural areas versus the city of Glasgow. And I wonder if you could talk about Lizzie's. One of the things one major things that happens pretty early is that Lily moves to Glasgow and gets a job and starts a life there, and yet it's not, she's wide-eyed and it's a wonderful experience, and she's, all the crowds and all the stuff going on, but it's also incredibly challenging, and she's still at the mercy of men, let's say. And I wonder if we could talk about just the where they're at economically and where she's at and the struggle that this family goes through. And one other thing I wanted to add is, they're people who, if they need to do something, they're going to have to sell some land, if they want to, make a particular purchase. Right. And, these are people without a lot of means, and yet she's giving it a shot,
To support my knowledge of Chrissy and Selby, I also read some farming diaries of that period. And one of the things that they made so clear was what a hard life farming was, and what a huge role the weather played. 6 months of work could be gone in a day. It sort of reminded me of writing. No, not really. But all that recycling that we do.
Right.
But so I felt very keenly aware that economics shaped everything, and the reason that my relatives ended up in Australia was money. They went there under what I think is called sponsored immigration. There was some small amount of money offered to get on a boat and spend 11 weeks getting to Australia.
Wow.
So I was always very conscious of how much money Lizzie had. I could have told you on any page how much money she had. And that was also true in my own childhood. I had a piggy bank, but I knew how much was in it.
My grandfather had a spending diary where he literally noted down every single cent that he ever spent, and I can trace that. I know what he spent on any given day.
That's amazing.
For years. It's
where
wild.
Was it? Where did he live?
Fall River, Massachusetts.
Fall River.
He owned a furniture store. Can we talk about Rab and Flora? Because if you're doing the math, these would be your great-great-grandparents, and so they are delightful characters in the novel. They're not perfect by any means. They make some very difficult decisions, but I'm wondering if you could talk about them and how you approach those characters, because I kind of fell in love with both of them.
I really didn't want them to be stereotypes. I didn't want Rab to be the gruff, severe patriarch, and I didn't want Flora to be, I don't know, the shrewish person or something. And partly I drew on George MacDonald's wonderful novels, The Princess and the Goblins, The Princess and Curdie, which books that I loved as a child. And the princess's father and her great-grandmother are both wonderful models of elderly material. But it was also one of the ways I used reading in the novel, that reading was something they could, over and above the life of the farm, that they could all share. And that seemed really important. And there is a long tradition of the well-educated Scottish farmer, Scottish smallholders and farmers and crofters being ardent readers and getting through the long winter by reading, which I imagine is true in Vermont as well.
Indeed.
I'm doing a plug for the bookstore here.
At one point, Flora, and it tells Lizzie that Lizzie is considering coming back to take care of Flora because Rab has passed away, which I don't think is giving away too much. And there's a lot more around why she wants to be back home and come back to the farm. But I don't want to give away too much. But at one point, Flora says something like, "You have to work with your own furrow." Am I getting the word right? And could you talk about just that idea that Flora's telling her, "Look, you have basically dug your, you've made your life in Glasgow, and now is not the time to come back to the farm." And it's kind of a heartbreaking scene and one of my favorites. And I'm just wondering if you could talk about that, just that idea that Flora's trying to convey.
She's trying to say to Lizzie, I think what she says is, you have to plough your own furrow.
Yes.
You can't step back, you can't come back. And I did mean Belhaven Farm to be a kind of potent place. I mean, it is home for Lizzie, and it is far from idyllic, but it has a huge draw for her, a huge attraction for her. And I thought I had invented the word Belhaven, but my Scottish friends pointed out that it's actually the name of a very well-known brewery, and suggested I try to get sponsorship. This hasn't happened yet. But I meant the name to sort of embody the sweetness of the farm and the lure of the farm. And yet Flora, Lizzie's beloved grandmother, is saying, but you have to go on, you have to. So the title is The Road from Belhaven,
yes.
Not to Belhaven.
Right.
It's how to leave home.
And it's very much a constant in this novel is this idea, Belhaven, even if it's a ways away, is always there, and that she carries it with her wherever she is. Can we talk about her sister Kate, who's a kind of surprise early on, is that Lizzie doesn't actually know that she has a sister, and then suddenly she has an older sister just out of nowhere, and yet she's there, she's crying in the next room. And it's this incredible development of learning that you have this very close kin, fairly late in your life. She's 13 at that point. Can you just talk about how that relationship evolved and how that came to you, et cetera? Because Kate is a wonderful character, also complex, and she's certainly horrible to Lizzie at the beginning, and yet is really very much an anchor, and the sibling relationship is a key to the book.
Well, you could see me when I'm writing about Lizzie's feelings for Kate, bringing to bear the feelings I had for my Australian relatives. Like, really? This person is related to me? Are you sure?
Right.
The evidence seems very sketchy. But one of the things that came up in my research in different ways over and over was the way in which children were so often passed around. You had too many children, you gave a couple to a sister or a brother who didn't, or to a grandparent. That children were thought of as property that could be disposed of in this way that's very different from nowadays. was very intrigued by the idea that Lizzie, who of course never sees any vision, any picture of Kate, would suddenly come home one day from school.
And there she is,
and
washing dishes.
Yes, yeah. And of course how complicated that relationship becomes, because Kate is not just her sister, she's her older sister.
And what I loved about it is that, an orphan suddenly becomes, like, she gets a family member, and yet it's totally not what you expect or what you wanted, or what, and it's complicated, and yet as it evolves, it becomes, a key relationship in her life. There's a wonderful description that Flo makes of her. She's as Thrawn as her mother.
Yeah.
Can you, what's Thrawn? Because I love that word, and I didn't look it up on purpose.
You didn't
because I
look it
just
up.
sort of wanted to enjoy it, because I knew what it meant. She's strong and she's difficult, and right, am I on the right track?
Thrawn means sort of stubborn and grumpy and bad-tempered somehow all together.
Yeah.
Some combination of those
There's
characteristics.
lots of words, like dreich, which is
Yeah.
early on, and Scottish words that come up in the book that I just love how they just are integrated into the text without any explanation, but we understand them because we are immersed. Can we talk about work? Work throughout the book is a major theme. It also is what drives much of the decisions that everybody makes in the book, and is a lot of pain is caused by the decisions that have to be made and the sacrifices that have to be made because people are making choices having to do with work.
Yeah. No, Lizzie never has the idea that of not working, of living in luxury or something resembling luxury. Even desperate moments, she's working in some way, whether it's just feeding the hens or bringing the ducks in from the pond, and I think that reflects my puritanical. My childhood wasn't Puritan, but it was puritanical in that as a child I had many duties. It was not leisurely being a child. I had school and homework and walking the dog and watering the garden and cleaning various parts of the house and doing grocery shopping, and it was endless. So I think I gave to Lizzie some of the many tasks I had. In fact, I thought her tasks were pleasanter in some ways.
Right. Well, she's constantly on the move in terms of how, and then when she gets to Glasgow, she's working, and she's also trying to figure out her life, and she has a great weight around her, and I want to just emphasize how moving her experience was as I get towards the end of the book, which again I'm always conscious that people haven't read it yet, but as she reckons with her choices, which are a result of her being naive about sex in general, for sure. It becomes incredibly emotionally resonant in ways that I didn't see coming all the time. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about sort of Lizzie, where she ends up without giving away too much.
Without saying anything.
Yeah, without saying anything, actually. And I want to open it up for questions, because I think we're about that time. But we can punt. But it just, how was finishing this book for you, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Well, I could say, I think if any of my former students were here, they would rise up in protest and disbelief. But I was very interested in writing about sex and in writing about, I think as a child, you think the world is organized in a certain way and that the adults are behaving according to reason. And then you cross some kind of line and you discover there is this thing, sexual attraction, that is sabotaging so many things and changing so many people's behavior and influencing so many decisions. And I think there's something fascinating about that moment when the known world changes so greatly in its meaning, I suppose. And you realize there's a dark river running under everything that you didn't know was there. And I think writing to the end of the novel, I would say that the end of the novel is in some ways for me, a political gesture, that I'm writing against what I see around me at the moment. I'm writing against the lack of compassion and kindness, the lack of civility, all the things that are happening nowadays that I wish weren't happening. And I hope that that won't be apparent to the reader until they've closed the book, but that was part of what I was writing towards in a certain way.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely felt that, and I feel it now, and I, you know, I mean, I guess, this is, Liz is no victim of anybody, you know, or she's not a victim even of her own decisions. She's just somebody who, like us all, sometimes gets into trouble because of her own, you know, and then sometimes gets involved with the wrong people, right? But so I felt like that was a kind of a radical political statement about her, you know, that she's able to not be stereotyped into being a victimhood. So.
And that she meets not always good people, but she does meet some people of goodwill.
Yeah, absolutely. And even the people who are not of great will are also, you know, have complexities too. Louis is not all bad, I don't think. In any case, let's open it up for questions from the audience, if you would. I have lots of other questions, but I want to open it to you guys. Yes. Block me. Yes.
I was very interested in the character Lewis and your choice to make him a tailor. And I wondered...
My choice to make him, sorry?
A tailor.
Yes.
And he's very good at it. And I was wondering if that had some roots in your own experience, or if there was a particular reason that you chose tailoring for his profession.
I think I chose tailoring partly for biographical reasons, partly because it is a profession with a long apprenticeship, and I was interested in that idea of the apprentice, of, you know, putting your life in service, as it were, for quite a number of years to learn a trade and hoping it will stand you in good stead. I was interested in the idea of him being able to make things and mend things. I wanted him to be a complex character. I named him after Robert Louis Stevenson, one of my heroes, but a completely flawed person. All those things came together in thinking about tailoring. I thought it was interesting, too, to give him a job that might be thought of more closely as women's work. Sewing is, you know, women are always mending and fixing and sewing, so I wanted him to do something like that.
Any questions?
Questions?
I have a question. Thank you, this is wonderful. It's more about your creative process in terms of first the genesis of the idea, but once you had a seed of the idea, did you sort of map it out, or is that your process to structure a little bit, or do you just follow the characters, or what is, at least with this book, what's your creative process?
After I came back from Australia, I had no plans to write about this material. I was already at work on another novel, and I just kept writing that and kept writing letters to my various cousins up and down the scale. But then in March 2020, I was writing another novel, and I realized to my dismay and horror that I was not going to be able to go to Scotland anytime soon. And I felt the only way I could begin to tolerate that was by writing a novel that allowed me to go to Scotland every day. So the road from Belhaven became my magic carpet. But of course, wanting to go to Scotland every day is not quite enough to generate a novel. So I had to think quite hard about my plot and how one of my private rules for writing novels is that I have to have a destination, even if I don't know how to get there. So I did spend quite some time thinking about that destination and making sure I had it in sight, even if distantly in sight. And then I drew maps of things like the farm, but I didn't map the novel.
Can you talk a little bit about Glasgow? as a city and as a
Writing
destination?
about Glasgow was thrilling for me. I grew up thinking of Glasgow as a poor relation, a slum city, and going to Edinburgh, which was upright and proper, and there was John Knox preaching against adultery, and Edinburgh was the place to be. And then I went to Glasgow and started reading about Glasgow, and I realised I was completely wrong. Glasgow had a university in the 1400s. It was a powerhouse of industry in the 19th century. The Glasgow shipyards were at their height. It was just a wonderful city in many ways. It was also a complicated city. It was sort of divided between Protestants and Catholics in interesting ways that I play only a very tiny role in the road from Belhaven. But I loved doing research in Glasgow. It was incredibly interesting to me, and I want to spend more time there, and I think we should all go as a sort of Norwich Bookstore outing.
It's a wonderful city, and it's very much a character in the book, and it made me want to go.
Yeah.
Other questions?
That's things you'd like to...
Can I ask you about Scottish writers, in particular one writer we share a love for, and that's Muriel Spark? Could you talk a little bit about her?
Muriel Spark is coming into her own, I would say. Her centenary was a few years ago, and they had wonderful celebrations, including Nicola Sturgeon, who was at that time, the head of the Scottish government, giving readings. Ian Rankin, who wrote his PhD on Muriel Spark, gave a reading. Ian Rankin writes a famous detective series, the Rebus series, and I love her work for its spikiness and its moral complexity, and how lightly it walks on the planet, and how much fun she seems to have writing her books. All of those things I find very rewarding.
And you could say that about your work too. How lightly it walks, and again how much. I mean, how much fun did you have writing this book? Because it seemed like it felt like you were that. It felt like there was joy in it.
There were many moments. Well, there were many moments of pleasure when I was just writing scenes. There were probably another 100 pages about farm life in the novel, which I have spared you. But the number of times we went to the hen house, and we went to the duck pond, and we milked a cow, and we fed a pet lamb, and we branded the sheep, and we sheared the sheep, I realised that really one only needed one example really of each thing. We didn't need to do all of that. But there were many moments, but that was part of the pleasure of writing the novel. And fortunately, my good friend Andrea Barrett pointed out that we didn't need quite so much agricultural information, that people were not reading my work to know how to run a small farm. And so a lot of recycling went on. No, there was a long period in my life when animals were my closest friends. I felt a failure as a human, but I had quite successful relationships with animals, and those kept me going. Now I like humans too.
And you mentioned letters, going back and forth, sending letters to Australia.
Yeah.
Letters play a big role in the book. I'm just wondering if you could just speak a little bit about the role that they play, because they not just move the plot, but there's a great deal of the family relationship that manifests in the letters themselves.
I love letters in books. I don't know if any of you read, what was it, Daddy Longlegs, an epistolary novel. I loved it as a child. And I love the way that the letter allows you to step out of the voice of the novel and write in the voice of the character, to think about things differently and to get to a more intimate level with the character. I also like the delayed gratification of letters. We wait for them. I will say that in the 19th century, the postal service was, in Britain at least, more efficient than it is today. You could count on getting a letter, and a number of the letters I've inherited make quite complicated arrangements, and people count on those arrangements, being accomplished. And I also think there's a way in which letters create a kind of intimacy that people give themselves away when they write. It's not just that we're hearing their intimate thoughts, but they give away things they don't mean to give away.
Yeah. There's a wonderful one in the middle of the book, in Lizzie's point of view, where she's writing to her sister, and it's so immediate that she's almost starts in mid-sentence. She says, "You were right," but it's lower capital. You is lowercase. "You were right, period." Lewis is very sorry, but he says he can't afford to get married until he finishes his work, etc. And it's just this kind of stab in the book that we know this, but we haven't really heard Lizzie say it to herself, And so I just found that those moments to be really striking in the letters.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
So another question about process, though. I haven't read your book, but I'm just so enchanted by the idea of the, there's this mystical thing you were talking about in the beginning, about being able to see, and then thinking about the writing process. Were there any surprises for you in writing this, where it wasn't about like sitting down and figuring things out, but there was like these particular jumps you would like to tell us about?
I sometimes think that writing is the closest I get to second sight, to seeing things I didn't know I knew, to having unexpected glimpses. And sometimes rereading feels like second sight, as I'm reading along something that I've partly forgotten, and I think, oh yeah, it's not going to go well for Romeo and Juliet. Whatever. So yes, there were many unexpected moments, and I wanted this to be in homage to the Victorians that Lizzie and I were both reading. I wanted this novel to be quite highly plotted, to be quite a lot happening, so I was always trying to make plot carry the reader along, like the trains Lizzie is always catching. So, yeah. But the surprises are one of the best parts about writing, even though some of them turn out to be disastrous mistakes. Peter is nodding sympathetically.
Yes. That's how it goes. Those surprises you can't, like Lizzie can't control when she knows what's going to happen to her grandfather, when she knows things are going to happen. It just felt like very much like, even if you don't have a second sight, I don't have a second sight either, but it felt like very much like how it is to kind of hurtle through your life and not being able to control it. And I feel like the book was almost homage to that idea that you can't, even if somebody knows, they can't, it's not going to help you. You're still grappling.
Is still grappling the note on which we should end?
I think you should have the last word.
Still grappling after all these years. Well, the last word is surely to all of you and to Norwich Bookshop. Nabokov said that a reader needs 3 things. I can only remember 2 of them. One is a dictionary and one is readers. And I feel so lucky that you came here this evening to listen to Peter and me converse. So thank you, and thank you for the wonderful hospitality of the bookshop.
Thank you.